Yeah, no problem. All right, folks, we're ready to start our next talk. We have Christie Dudley doing corporate governance for fund and nonprofits, excuse me. Christie started with a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering with an emphasis in digital communications. She went on to work in network engineering and finance and manufacturing before jumping ship to study anthropology. After a time waiting for the great anthropology industry boom that never seemed to come to pass, she drifted back into tech, delving more into information and device security. With the goal of wrapping all these diverse interests up in a single career, she earned a Juris Doctor from Santa Clara University, and she now consults on privacy and legal issues. And if she hadn't told me as much about the privacy implications of connected vehicle digital short-range communications as she has over the last few years, I'd probably sleep a lot better at night. Please put your hands together for Christie Dudley.
Wow, that was more of an introduction than I really expected. So I'm here to talk about something kind of on the periphery of everything else that we've been talking about here this weekend. And the idea is that I've worked with a lot of you. Jack Daniel at BSides Las Vegas talked about forming your own nonprofit and different not-for-profit models that are options, really with the idea of encouraging people to start these. Well, once you start, starting is only the first step. Keeping them running is actually where you can get yourself into trouble. And I also recognize that this is a big stumbling block or point of concern for a lot of technical people who don't really get the business, corporate, legal stuff, and you could get into a lot of hot water, et cetera, et cetera. Really, I'm here to tell you, okay, these are the things you need to do. They're fairly simple if you want to follow them. Also, I wanted to point out what I'm talking about here today is only for corporations, nonprofit corporations. That's how you form them. If you're interested in for-profit corporations, a lot of what I'm saying here will apply, but other forms of organizations, not so much. Okay, who am I? I am technical. He gave more of an introduction than I planned to. But I've been engaged with a community for a long time, and a lot of people come to me with issues. I've been involved in the formation of an organization as well as working out the tax status of another organization and getting a lot of things together for people. Since I studied law and know the law, people look to me. And oh, by the way, I am available if you're looking for help with things. So, first of all, incorporation is easy. I have here a section of the form that has the majority of the information that you need to fill out in order to form a corporation. Yes, it's a one-page form issued by the Secretary of State of California, and that's all you need to know. All you need to do. You form a corporation for any legal purpose, and they even have the language that you need on the form for the 501c3 formalities or any other organization that you'd want. So a lot of people wind up, I have to make an aside here, a lot of people wind up paying $900 for online services to file their organizations, which is kind of silly because this is a simple form. It's easier than a tax form. But that's the first step. It's an easy first step, and anybody can do it. So it's $35. Why not? The real question of why not is accountability. Okay, you file the form. You are now accountable as an organization. If you had a for-profit, you'd be accountable to your shareholders because they own you, your organization. But since you're not, and you don't have shareholders, you have donors who you are not answerable to, because that would wind up being very close to a for-profit organization if you're operating at the will of your donors. So you'd like to encourage donors, but they can't tell you what to do. So who can? Nobody. Nobody can tell you what to do except the state in a few very specific corporate formalities. So what the state's done is established or defined roles and assigned duties. Every state has done this. It's a fairly uniform practice, although I have a focus in California. I really look at California law, so that's where I'm looking from. So the formal rules. Okay. Before you become incorporated, you don't have officers. You can't have officers because you don't have an organization to be officers of. So everybody who is acting as an officer is actually legally called a promoter. You're promoting the organization, you're establishing it. And so that role is a separate role from the time that you become incorporated. And then once you become incorporated, you have your board of directors and your officers. People get these confused a lot. Officers are different than directors. Directors don't do anything. That's the role of directors. They are not supposed to do anything. In fact, it's kind of a cultural common belief that it's a good idea not to have, or to have at least half of your board of directors not involved in any operational role at all, so that they can be outside advisors and have a unique perspective. So the board of directors, they only make decisions and tell other people what to do, basically. So the other people who actually get stuff done are the officers, the president, the treasurer, the secretary. These are legally defined roles. You must have each office filled in every organization. You can't, leave an office empty. So you have to have either an acting or an active or a permanent. And then there's another legally defined role that covers all the other, whatever, if you want to call them officers, if you want to call them members, whatever. They're all, everybody else other than these three and the board of directors, they're just agents. Board of directors, by the way, aren't agents, and that'll become more apparent. Agents are people who do stuff but don't have the accountability of other people. So here's a relationship, and it's really important to consider the directors hire and fire. That's one of their major roles. They hire and fire. That's a decision. They make the decision on the budget. They make decisions on what you will be doing next year. Really high-level stuff, but not, down in the weeds, we need to get this person or that person in. Directors don't, if you have an organization that's, say, looking at a conference, your directors aren't the ones who pick the speakers. You have people for that. And that's more of an operational role because you're having to do stuff. So although the directors hire and fire these people, they can be the same people. It's not always a good idea to have them all exactly the same people. It's also a good idea to have an odd number of directors. That way, because most of what directors do is vote, having an odd number eliminates those challenges there. So, and there's chairman of the board. People talk about that as if it were a special role. Really, chairman of the board is just the person who sets the agenda. Sometimes they have the chairman taking the minutes. Sometimes they have the secretary for the organization taking the minutes. It's not important. The secretary is responsible for recording the minutes and making sure that they're kept up to date in the corporate records and that they're approved. But there are a lot of different people who can actually do the job. So, the The next problem that you get with this kind of structure is in selecting so the directors select, like the president quits, you need a new president, the directors select, or the president's bad-mouthing the organization, you want them out, the directors select a new. Well, the problem is who selects the directors? In a for-profit corporation, you have shareholders, and the shareholders vote, and they say, okay, this director is our director. But that can't work with a nonprofit because you don't have shareholders. So there's no statutory way to deal with this. On almost every other thing having to do with a corporation, there are defaults. You can change the defaults, but there are defaults. But there's no default for selecting a new director. Usually what happens is the other directors get together and decide. But it's really a good idea to have that in your either articles of incorporation, which was that one-page form, so you probably don't have it there, but your bylaws, which talk about how your organization operates. It should have director selection in there if you're a nonprofit corporation. So, oh, and one more thing I wanted to point out. I think I'll get back to this later, but the president has to be different than a different person than the secretary and treasurer, but the secretary and treasurer can wear two hats. They can be both the secretary and the treasurer. That's giving an awful lot of power and an awful lot of responsibility to a single person, and we'll get back into that. But this can be a total of 3 people, and you're done. It's usually a good idea to have at least 4, but that's what can happen. Okay, directors. Their responsibility is to approve the bylaws and attend meetings, at least 1 a year, and follow all the duties that every single officer and director must follow. And these 4 duties, it's really important that everybody who is responsible for leading a nonprofit organization be aware of these. So first I'll talk about the meeting formalities. You have to have one annual meeting. You have to have formal notification unless it is a standing board meeting, and this has to have any agenda items that aren't recurring. The idea is sometimes when there are board takeovers, and almost all of these have to do with conflict within the organization and how you deal with and address conflict. So if you have a board meeting with an agenda item that somebody doesn't know about in advance, and so they show up to the meeting and they're not prepared for your attempt at corporate takeover or something like that, then it becomes a representational issue and a problem for the organization. So you have to have your formal notification 2 weeks in advance. Pardon me. So you have to have a quorum. So you have your formal notification and you send it out when all the officers or all the directors, I'm doing it too, all the directors you don't like are on vacation. And you know they're going to be gone, so they can't show up. That's not okay. You have to have a quorum, and you have to, the statutory default for quorum, I believe, is 2/3 of the directors. But you can change that in your bylaws if you want to do that. All binding decisions, mainly things like appointing the president, approving the budget, all the really important stuff must be made, making commitments, they must be made in a meeting where you have recorded and approved minutes. Minutes have to be approved by the board as well, or else they could be called into question if there's challenge. So they have to be recorded and approved, and they have to be or unanimous consent. And I've seen a lot of stuff. Unanimous consent is a really good way to get stuff decided in an organization where people are on the go, because you can do it asynchronously via email. A lot of the reason for the meeting minutes is that these are public. You have a public corporation. You have an organization serving the public. The public has a right to review these minutes. And they have a right to see who voted on which issues. So, moving on. Fiduciary duty. This is a duty for you're responsible for your organization. You have to take care in how you spend your money. This is tax-exempt donations. The donors can't make a complaint, but the Secretary of State, the DOJ in California has an interest in charitable organizations, so that to make sure that they're still operating as a charity for public benefit. And so they from time to time look in on finances. So you need to not use a little sense here in serving your organization, not yourself. Duty of care. You need to pay attention, and it's your responsibility to keep up with what's going on with your organization. Ignorance of what's happening in your organization is not a defense against anything that's bad that's happening. Once you step up to that role, if you don't know, then it's on you. There have been cases to support this. An old woman inherited a directorship from her husband, and she was kind of dotty, but she lost. She wound up being liable as a director for the actions of the subordinates because she just wasn't paying attention. So you need to pay attention. And it's a good thing you're here because you're learning about what you need to know and do, and so that's part of the duty of care. Duty of loyalty is you can't compete with your own organization if you're a director. And there have been a lot of interesting things. In Silicon Valley, duty of loyalty is actually one of the things that's contracted out in the bylaws or in membership agreements, various documents where, say, an investor wants to invest in multiple companies and put his guys on the board of directors. So they agree in the bylaws, they agree that they'll waive the duty of loyalty. If you waive the duty of loyalty for a nonprofit, you will lose your nonprofit status. Because that's one of the things they look for is you can't set up a straw man to pillage, basically. And the IRS looks for that sort of thing. And it's really important not to talk down your own organization even. It seems very counterintuitive, but it's the sort of thing that you stand for that organization for a reason, and you need to continue standing for it, or else you'll tear down the work of everybody else around you because you speak with a louder voice than those outside your organization. The duty of good faith. You can't give lip service and expect to get away with it. The courts figured that out a long time ago. You can't get around the fiduciary duties or the duty of any of the other duties simply because you've come up with a good story to explain it. They actually can dig pretty deep and determine that what your actual intentions were. Okay, moving on. We're talking about officers now. I'm good time, I guess. The officers are responsible for how the organization works. The directors, a lot of hot air. That's their job. And often in a for-profit, and sometimes even in nonprofit corporations, if they're large, they get paid for that. And it's reasonable to pay them because the decisions they make are so weighty. If you're throwing around thousands or millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands or millions, not thousands, then there's a lot of responsibility on your shoulders. So anyway, the president is responsible for the overall functioning of the organization, but there are not any specific duties for the president. The president doesn't have to do really anything except lead the organization on a day-to-day basis. But again, those general duties, they apply to everyone, including the president. So the secretary has a lot more. In fact, I talked to somebody who is a secretary for a nonprofit organization, and he said, oh, wow, I have all the power. I sit down on the board meetings, and I take notes, and I could post anything, and they'd approve it. That's kind of one of those bad faith sorts of deals, but he always posted everything correctly. But it's their responsibility to keep the corporate records. So if a member of the public decides that they want to go and look at your records, because corporations are answerable to the public if they're public, then they have to, you have to have them ready and a reasonable time present them. You might have requirements like if you have to mail them or something, or they have to show up at your offices, but they have to be made available. And also decisions. Every decision that's made by the organization to include, especially to include the budget, that has to be in that record that's approved by the directors. And then treasurer. This is the last specific role for an organization. They have to keep all the financial records, just like the secretary keeps records of all the decisions, the treasurer keeps records of all the finances. And it is the treasurer's duty to make all the necessary tax filings. So if there's any discrepancy, it's also on the treasurer to figure that out or make it up. And that can be kind of scary for somebody to take on that role as well. So now you have all these responsibilities. What do you get to do? Okay. The board of directors votes. That's their thing. Nobody else gets to vote. This may sound obvious, but some people don't get it. So, in fact, in California, they've recently passed a statute figuring out that there have been shadow board members floating around unduly influencing organizations. And so they passed a statute saying you can't do that. Everybody who's there has to have a specific reason to be there. Frequently you see, like, for example, the secretary is not on the board. The secretary's there to take minutes. That's cool. It's not cool to have people who are not board members who are influencing the board. But the treasurer and the president have the authority to spend money. The president, if you recall, has no accountability, but he has the ability to spend money, which is kind of cool and kind of scary and broken. But only one person has to be accountable for each item, and the treasurer is responsible for that. The president should be fired by the board if they come into conflict, but that's how it works. And that's pretty much it as far as authorities specific to the roles. But there are those two special roles that I talked about in the beginning, the promoter and the agent. The promoter's role is, as I mentioned, before you form a corporation, there's a lot of stuff going on. You've got to form the corporation. You've got to get all your agreements and all your contracts and all your stuff together. It's important that to recognize that as you're beginning to form, each person takes on that liability personally. You don't have the protection of the corporation. You don't have the organization. They don't own it. They don't have it. They're not responsible for it. It's all on you as an individual. As soon as the corporation forms, a couple of things can happen. First of all, you have to grant the property to the corporation. Second of all, you have to sign over or the board has to adopt all the agreements and contracts. That's kind of a weird thing that happens. And then the third thing is you have to, with all the people you have contracts with, you have to get what's called a novation, which means that the person you sign the contract with has to agree not to hold you personally liable any longer, which can sometimes be a problem if they don't understand in advance that you're forming this organization and that although you're signing it now, you want to have it signed over to the organization once it's formed and legal. So, because what happens then is they can no longer go after you and all your assets, and you have this limited liability, brand new, has no assets organization. They might not want to agree to that, and they might want to rescind the contract entirely and say, forget it. Question? That's a good question. The question was, why don't you file as soon as possible? A lot of people think it's hard to file. I think that's the best thing I can think of. But you get your corporation backdated to the date that they receive it. So I don't know, actually. But I think a lot of people think it's hard to form a corporation. People will pay LegalZoom $800-900 to do effectively fill out the one-page form, but they wouldn't be in business. I have friends that have made an entire business out of fixing the problems at LegalZoom because LegalZoom doesn't actually give you advice. So, and that's what you're paying a lawyer for. You're not paying them to fill out forms or do that. You're paying them to give you advice. So, free advice. I am not a lawyer, by the way. I'm not licensed in any state yet. Just to let you know. Yet is the key word. This is to give you an idea of your responsibilities. So, take that as you will. So anyway. Oh, right. That's a good point. What Jack Daniel was saying was that if you're not well, first of all, if you plan to be a 501c3, then you need to not do certain things, and that's a state thing. State by state has different requirements, but you can't do there's a long list of things you cannot do. And if you don't want to have that, if you want to do one of those things on the list, then you do it before you're incorporated, and it's okay. Also, another reason is if you're not sure about what form of corporation you want. Like there's 501c3, which is public benefit. I formed a 501c7, which is basically a country club. It's a mutual benefit organization where you basically share your assets and you're not taxed on anything, but you also are not able to take tax or let people take their their donations off their taxes, which is a huge benefit of the C3. And a C4 if you want to do political lobbying, a C6 if you... Anyway, there are lots of different organizations, and go look at Jack's talk if you want to see the discussion on several of them. So if you're not sure about what form you want, or if you want to do things outside of the ideal that you're shooting for, there are some good reasons to do that. An agent is somebody... They can have, I remember somebody coming up to me and saying, I am the CIO of Hackerspace. And it's like, well, that's not a legally defined role. Fine. Cool. I'm glad you have that title. I guess that makes you an agent of that Hackerspace. And so what that means is if they've given you a title and they've given you an area of responsibility, then there's an implied authority to act on behalf of that organization within the scope of that title. So the commitments that you make are binding to the organization unless the organization says otherwise. And in fact, if that happens and there's any question, like the CIO happens to be buying office supplies with purchase orders generated for the organization, and the organization didn't really want the office supplies, if they accept them and keep accepting them and decide, oh, why is this person ordering office supplies? It should be that person. We shouldn't have to pay for that. Well, then that's a problem because they've accepted it in the past, and so that generates an implied authorization to do that. Agents also have the same duties that the officers and directors do when performing their agency tasks, basically, except loyalty. You can have a real estate agent that's, all over the place, or a promoter, or all sorts of different types of agents that corporations enlist to do different things. So there's a lot of flexibility with this, and a lot of people get really caught up in the idea that only the officers and directors have the right or ability to make decisions on behalf of the organization. I bought stuff for the Red Cross. It was a sheltering operation, and they needed somebody to come in and help or manage to get food for people. And I made arrangements, and I went and picked it up and paid for it, and all on the Red Cross's dime. And I was acting in that capacity as an agent for the Red Cross. I didn't have to have 3 levels of approval, no president or official person signing off on it. So agents are very important to the functioning of the organization, and they're pretty much ad hoc, but they don't have the duties the secretary and treasurer do, which are the really big ones, only secondary to the board meetings. So now, the penalties can be very serious if you don't follow these. It's not going to jail time, nothing here. It's not legal to not hold a board meeting every year, but you're not going to jail for it. I don't like to call it illegal, it's extra legal. You can get fined pretty seriously for that. You can face lawsuits. The DOJ might get really uptight about it, or the AG's office, not DOJ. The state attorney general's office might come down on you, and more likely the IRS will be, or not the IRS. The IRS is the nice people. The California Franchise Tax Board, they have no humor at all. So somebody who has dealt with the FTB, they're not fun people. So, however, the wonderful thing about financial challenges like that is you can buy insurance to cover any mistakes you make. And I really, really highly recommend you do that. If you have any money at all, buy your insurance. Also, if you have any money at all, pay a nonprofit specialist to do your taxes, and get a nonprofit attorney to go over your bylaws, and pay these people, because a lot of people, I've been approached by a number of people, and it's like, you're really lucky if you find somebody who's willing to do nonprofit work for you in an attorney capacity, because it's a very different area of law than for-profit law. And so because this area of law is so different, and the issues that you face and the specific problems that you have in abiding by these laws is these are very special areas that you need to have addressed. The attorneys that are interested in gaining experience, it's not useful to them. The attorneys who do the nonprofits, they don't make a lot of money anyway, And so they have to do this full time. And you're trying to tell people that you are more worthy than the women's shelter who is barely funded and barely has beds for people. You're trying to tell people that you, who can get corporate money, can't afford to pay a lawyer and help support all these other nonprofit organizations, because that's what you're doing when you pay services that specialize in nonprofits. You're helping the nonprofit universe when you do that. So, any questions? No questions. In the back. I'm sorry? Yeah, my slides will be available, so that you can go back and look over them. I usually post them on SlideShare. I have a SlideShare that I have all my slides posted to. So, great. Any more questions? Wow.
All right, folks, thank you. We are going to take a break, and we'll be back on the hour with our next talk, which is